The limestone mountains of Chiapas hold secrets that have survived 5 centuries of silence. Among their peaks and valleys lies a network of caves known only to a handful of descendants of the ancient Mayan civilization, places where the old practices never truly ended, merely retreated into darkness and stone. When archaeologist Marcus Rivera inherited his grandfather's journal, he found more than faded sketches and cryptic notes. He discovered a location marked with a single symbol and a warning written in Spanish. The offerings are kept alive. Do not disturb the vigil. Marcus had spent 15 years studying pre-Hispanic customs, but nothing had prepared him for what that phrase truly meant. His brother Felipe, a geologist with expertise in cave systems, was skeptical until Marcus showed him satellite imagery of the region, thermal signatures near what appeared to be undisturbed cavern entrances. The heat patterns suggested active fire, burning continuously for months, perhaps longer. In modern times, fires in remote caves don't simply maintain themselves. Something or someone was keeping them alive. By late October, after weeks of permits, local consultations, and careful negotiations with indigenous communities, the brothers stood at the entrance of a cave system 30 kilometers northwest of San Cristobal de las Casas. The air that emerged from the darkness carried the unmistakable scent of copal, the sacred resin burned in Mayan ceremonies for millennia. Their grandfather's journal was not a relic of the past. It was a map to a living ritual, one that had somehow remained unbroken through conquest, colonization, and modernity. What they didn't know was that they weren't the only ones searching for these caves. A rival team from Mexico City, wealthy collectors with connections to private museums, had intercepted communications about the thermal signatures. And deeper still, in the chambers below, the keepers of the tradition were preparing for the arrival of outsiders, uncertain whether these visitors came to understand or to plunder. The descent into the mountain was about to change everything. Chapter 1. The Map and the Decision. The journal lay open on Marcus's desk, its pages yellowed and brittle, handwriting fading into illegibility in places. His grandfather, Santiago Rivera, had been an amateur archaeologist in the 1960s, one of the few outsiders ever permitted to witness certain ceremonies in the remote caves of Chiapas. Most of his work had been dismissed by the academic community as folklore and conjecture. But Marcus had spent enough time in archives to recognize genuine observation beneath the poetic language. Santiago's final entry, dated March 1978, described a cavern illuminated by firelight, walls covered in symbols that matched no known Mayan script, and offerings arranged in concentric circles around a central pit. At the margin of the page, sketched in pencil, was a map showing 3 mountains in alignment, a river bend, and a single symbol repeated 3 times, a circle with a cross inside. Below it, the warning: "The offerings are kept alive. Do not disturb the vigil." Marcus had shown the journal to Felipe only after confirming the coordinates using modern surveying tools. His brother, standing in their Mexico City apartment with rain falling against the windows, had laughed at first, Abuela's stories brought to life. But when Marcus pulled up the thermal imaging data from the previous month, Felipe's skepticism crumbled. "That's not possible," Felipe whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "There's no documented volcanic activity in that region for 10,000 years, and the heat signature is too stable, too consistent. It's not a geological phenomenon." Then what? Either someone is maintaining a fire continuously in a sealed environment, which would require constant resupply and access, or your grandfather was right, and something very strange is happening in those mountains. The decision to mount an expedition came quickly. Marcus had contacts within Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology, colleagues who owed him favors from joint research projects. Felipe had spent 3 years mapping cave systems throughout southern Mexico and had the technical skills to navigate unstable terrain safely. Together, they could do this properly, with respect for the location's cultural significance and academic rigor. What they couldn't account for was the attention their expedition had already attracted. In a hotel in Mexico City, 2 men in tailored suits studied the same satellite imagery, their interest far less academic and far more profitable. And in a settlement nested in the Chiapas highlands, indigenous elders gathered to discuss the arrival of the outsiders, debating whether the ancient compact allowed for witnesses or whether the vigil must remain unbroken. The mountains were waiting, the fire was still burning, and none of them understood yet that some mysteries are protected not by stone and darkness, but by the unshakable faith of those who came before. Chapter 2. The Valley of Stone. The journey into the mountains began before dawn. Marcus and Felipe traveled with 2 local guides, Miguel and Rosa, whose family had lived in the region for generations. Neither guide would say directly what they knew about the caves, but their knowledge was evident in the way they moved through the forest, reading the landscape like a text written in subtle signs, a particular arrangement of stones, a tree marked with old machete scars, a path that existed only in memory and habit. The forest around them grew thicker as they descended into a canyon. Chiapas trees towering above, their massive roots exposed like veins across the limestone cliffs. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decomposing vegetation, but underneath it all, faint yet unmistakable, was the scent of copal smoke. Felipe tested the rock formations as they walked, running his fingers across the stone, identifying mineral deposits and structural weaknesses. "This whole region is a maze of caves," he said, pulling out his surveying equipment. "If there's active burning happening inside, the smoke should be venting somewhere. We just need to find it." It was Rosa who spotted the first sign. A natural chimney in the cliff face, barely visible from below, where smoke in a thin, steady stream rose into the canopy. The opening was perhaps 2 meters wide and 30 meters up, but around its base, on the ground below, lay scattered fragments of pottery, some of them modern, broken within the last few years, judging by the absence of weathering. "Recent activity," Marcus murmured, photographing the fragments. "People have been here, recently. People, or something that wants us to think people have been here," Miguel said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made Marcus look up. The guide was staring at the cliff face, at the column of smoke rising steadily into the forest canopy, and his expression carried a mixture of respect and warning. "Your grandfather was told not to disturb the vigil," Rosa said. "It wasn't a question. That's what the old stories say. There are offerings that must burn, copal that must smoke. If the smoke stops, something very old is dishonored." "Who maintains the fire?" Felipe asked. Neither guide answered. They simply pointed deeper into the canyon, where a narrow opening in the rock face became visible as the light shifted. The entrance was barely more than a crack, but from within came that same scent of copal, stronger now, and something else, the faint roar of moving water echoing from chambers far below. Marcus checked his equipment one final time. Rope, harnesses, climbing hardware, lights, recording devices. His heart was beating faster than the hike justified. They were close now to whatever Santiago had found 50 years ago, to the mystery that had consumed his grandfather's final years and driven him to fill a journal with warnings. As they approached the cave entrance, none of them noticed the figure moving through the trees above them, watching from the ridgeline. The man was dressed in modern hiking gear, expensive and well-maintained, and he was speaking quietly into a satellite phone. "We've found their location. They're about to enter the main system. Prepare the team." Chapter 3. The First Passage. The cave entrance was smaller up close than it appeared from a distance, barely 1.5 meters tall, which meant crawling on hands and knees for the first section, squeezing between walls of limestone so close that Marcus could feel the humidity of the stone against both sides of his body simultaneously. Behind him, Felipe grunted with effort, muttering complaints about the intelligence of their expedition in general and Marcus's career decisions in particular. After perhaps 30 meters, the passage opened into a chamber large enough to stand. Marcus clicked on his primary light, and the darkness dissolved into a vast space. The ceiling was lost in shadow 20 meters overhead, and the walls were smooth and rounded by ancient water flow. The scent of copal was overwhelming now, almost thick enough to see, curling through the air in deliberate spirals that meant only one thing. The fire was close. Rosa and Miguel had gone quiet, moving with reverent steps, their own lights pointed downward in a gesture that seemed less practical and more spiritual. "There," Felipe pointed. Ahead, the cavern floor descended in a natural staircase of stone, each step worn smooth by countless footfalls, and at the base of those steps, visible as a flickering glow against distant walls, was firelight. The group descended slowly, Marcus documenting everything with his camera. The walls showed the first markings, symbols carved or painted in what appeared to be multiple periods, some so ancient they were barely visible, others more recent, dating perhaps to the colonial period or even later. Mixed among them were modern marks, names carved into the stone: June 1997, Guardians of the Flame, and The Vigil Continues, 2012. As they reached the lower chamber, the source of the light became clear. In the center of a wide, circular space, a carefully maintained fire burned in a stone pit, consuming copal resin that produced thick, fragrant smoke. Around the fire, arranged in precise geometric patterns, lay offerings: ceramic vessels, jade pendants, obsidian blades, and at the center, a stone tablet covered in glyphs. "This is impossible," Felipe whispered. "The copal alone, it requires constant attention, replacement, proper airflow." He was interrupted by a sound from the shadows, movement, footsteps, voices speaking in Spanish and then in a language Marcus recognized as Chol, one of the Mayan languages still spoken in the region. 3 figures emerged from the darkness opposite them. 2 were elderly indigenous men, their faces weathered and serious. Between them stood a younger woman, perhaps 30, with eyes that held both welcome and warning. "Your grandfather promised to protect this place," she said in careful English, addressing Marcus directly. "Did he tell you what that meant? Did he explain the price of knowledge?" Before Marcus could respond, a sound erupted from the passage above them, the unmistakable noise of climbing equipment, rappelling gear, multiple people descending rapidly. The fire in the pit suddenly seemed to flicker, and the woman's hand moved to a small pouch at her waist. "If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from." Chapter 4. The Chamber Revealed. The intruders descended with practiced efficiency, 6 of them, equipped with professional climbing gear and headlamps mounted on tactical helmets. The lead figure was a man in his 50s with sharp features and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Behind him came 2 younger men carrying equipment bags, followed by 3 others whose roles were less immediately clear. "Lower your weapons," the lead man said, though none of the explorers had drawn weapons. The command was directed at Rosa and Miguel, who stood protectively in front of Marcus and Felipe. The tone suggested this wasn't his first confrontation. "Dr. Hernan Vasquez," Rosa said quietly, her voice carrying recognition and something like contempt. "We heard you were looting museums in Oaxaca." Vasquez smiled without warmth. "Not looting, rescuing. These artifacts belong in proper institutions where they can be studied and preserved, not abandoned in holes in the ground to be consumed by time and moisture. The elderly men stepped forward, and their Spanish came with the accent of the highlands, measured and deliberate. "These offerings are not museum pieces," the first man said. "They are part of a continuous tradition that has never been broken. Your museums are tombs. This," he gestured to the fire, "is alive." The stone tablet in the center of the chamber suddenly became the focal point of everyone's attention. Vasquez's team began moving toward it, and Felipe, reacting instinctively, stepped between them and the artifact. "That tablet is covered in glyphs we haven't documented anywhere else," Felipe said, his voice steady. "If you remove it without proper archaeological methodology—" "We're not here to be proper," one of Vasquez's team members interrupted. He was already photographing the chamber, documenting everything with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Marcus's mind was racing, parsing the situation. Vasquez was a known figure in the underground antiquities trade, someone who had appeared in academic scandals a decade ago and seemingly disappeared from legitimate circles. That he was here with a team suggested he'd received information about the cave system's contents. The question was, how much had he learned, and what was he willing to do to claim it? The young woman who had first spoken to them stepped slightly forward, and Vasquez's demeanor shifted. There was recognition in his eyes, and something like respect mixed with caution. "Dr. Alicia Morales," he said. "I didn't expect to find you still guarding the old traditions. I thought you were teaching anthropology in Mexico City." "I took a leave of absence," Alicia replied. "Some things are more important than academic careers. Some things are worth protecting." Behind them the fire continued to burn, the copal smoke rising in steady columns that the chamber's natural ventilation carried upward and away. Marcus found his eyes drawn to the symbols on the walls surrounding the pit. They weren't random. They told a narrative that spiraled around the chamber in a deliberate sequence. "The flame has been maintained continuously for over 500 years, Alicia said, addressing everyone, but looking at Vasquez. Not by magic, by human commitment, by a choice, repeated generation after generation, to keep these offerings burning as a way of honoring the ancestors and maintaining a connection to what was lost in the conquest. Your grandfather understood this," she added, turning to Marcus. "That's why he wrote the warning, not because the flame was dangerous, but because it was sacred." One of Vasquez's team members had moved to the tablet, photographing it from multiple angles. Felipe made a move to stop him, but Miguel placed a hand on his arm, holding him back. "Let him photograph," the elder said quietly. "The images don't steal the spirit. Let him see what he is so desperate to possess." "What is it?" Marcus asked, directing his question at Alicia. "What does the tablet say?" She walked to it slowly, reverently, and pointed to the central glyph. "It's a record. Names of the guardians who maintained the vigil during the Spanish occupation. Dates, methods, instructions for preserving the sacred fire in hiding. Your grandfather found this 50 years ago. He was offered guardianship but refused. He said the responsibility belonged only to those whose ancestors had received it first. He asked only that we preserve the knowledge, that we document it for a day when the world was ready to understand that not everything valuable can be measured or owned." The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Even Vasquez's team had stopped moving, sensing the weight of history in the air and the copal smoke that seemed to carry it. "There is another chamber," the second elder said suddenly, "deeper, below the offering pit. That is where Santiago went. That is where the true archive lies." Chapter 5. Symbols and Secrets. The floor beneath the fire pit was not solid stone. It was a carefully constructed seal of fitted limestone blocks, arranged in a pattern that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The elder produced a small wooden pry bar, worn smooth by decades of use, and began carefully working it between the stones. Felipe immediately moved to help, his geological knowledge suddenly applicable in a way that academic study never suggested it could be. "The key is distribution of pressure," he murmured, working methodically as Marcus documented every step. Whoever designed this wanted to prevent accidental discovery but make intentional opening possible. It took 20 minutes. Vasquez's team grew visibly impatient, the lead members already photographing the chamber's full contents, but Alicia had subtly positioned herself to block direct access to the pit's center, a movement so natural it appeared almost accidental. When the final stone lifted free, it revealed not a grand chamber, but a narrow shaft, barely a meter wide, descending into darkness. The sound of water was louder here, echoing from below with the resonance of a substantial underground river. "The archive is protected by depth and flooding," the elder explained. "During the rainy season, the water level rises. During the dry season, it recedes. The documents are stored above the high water mark in chambers carved into the shaft walls. Only those who know the rhythms of the seasons and the mountain can retrieve them safely." Marcus felt understanding crystallize. This wasn't a treasure hidden for its market value. This was a preservation system, a way of keeping knowledge alive, while simultaneously ensuring that only those with sufficient commitment and knowledge could access it. The records include correspondence between indigenous leaders during the conquest period, Alicia explained, speaking partly to Marcus and partly to Vasquez, who was listening despite his studied disinterest. Letters written in Spanish by Mayan scribes who had learned the colonizers' language. A census of communities that were never formally recorded by the Spanish authorities, which means they were never subjected to the encomienda system. Testimony about the early phases of cultural suppression. In academic terms, it's an archive that challenges fundamental assumptions about the Spanish conquest. Which makes it extremely valuable to certain private collectors, Vasquez said, his tone making clear he was one of them. These documents belong in a controlled environment where they can be properly preserved, not in a cave system where moisture and time are destroying them. "They belong where they are," Rosa said flatly, "where they have been kept alive through the commitment of guardians whose names are written on that tablet, where they are part of a living tradition, not a museum display." The standoff was interrupted by a sound from above. Footsteps and voices, multiple people moving through the upper chamber. Vasquez's face hardened, and he moved to the rappelling rope with sudden urgency. "We have company," one of his team members called down. "Park rangers, possibly indigenous authorities as well. Someone called it in." The irony was immediate and sharp. In their focus on the discovery, they had not considered that others were watching, monitoring, and ready to intervene. The legal authorities of Mexico, combined with the official recognition of indigenous cultural rights, had created a buffer around this place. Vasquez made a rapid calculation, visible in the way his eyes moved from the tablet to the shaft to Marcus and back. His team was already gathering equipment, preparing to ascend. "This isn't over," he said, addressing the group but looking at Alicia. "These artifacts are significant enough that attention will keep coming. Academic attention, government attention, international attention. The mountain will eventually be mapped completely, catalogued, and processed through official channels. When that happens, the vigil becomes impossible to maintain." "Perhaps," Alicia said, "or perhaps the mountain will teach those who come with respect instead of greed. Perhaps the real discovery isn't what's here, but why it matters." Above them, the cave echoed with approaching footsteps. Within moments, the character of the expedition changed entirely. Chapter 6. rivals in the dark. The rangers who descended into the chamber were professional and thorough, led by a woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone who had spent her career protecting Mexico's natural and cultural heritage. Beside her came two indigenous officials from the local cultural authority, men who greeted Rosa and Miguel with formal respect, and who looked at the offering pit and the glyph-covered tablet with expressions of recognition and solemnity. Vasquez and his team were detained pending verification of their permits and intentions, which were quickly revealed to be neither legitimate nor legal. But the larger dynamic was what mattered. A space that had existed in shadow and secrecy was now suddenly placed into the light of official attention, legal frameworks, and bureaucratic process. The ranger, who introduced herself as Dr. Gabriela Sandoval, approached Marcus with professional courtesy but genuine interest. She had read his published work on Mayan ritual spaces and, after brief consultation with the cultural officials, seemed satisfied that his presence was motivated by legitimate academic inquiry rather than commercial intent. "How much of the archive do you think is salvageable?" she asked Felipe, who was examining the upper walls of the shaft with increasingly worried expressions. "If the flooding cycles have been regular and the storage method is as sophisticated as the elder describes, potentially most of it," Felipe replied. "But extraction is going to require expertise and patience. These aren't artifacts that can be removed hastily." Alicia had been conversing quietly with the cultural officials, and when she turned back to Marcus, there was something like decision in her expression. "Your grandfather was offered guardianship," she said. "He refused because he wasn't from here, wasn't part of the tradition. But he asked for something different. He asked that the knowledge be documented, preserved in a form that could survive even if the cave system was destroyed, the fire extinguished, the tradition broken." She produced a second journal from a hidden pocket in her jacket. Not Santiago's, but a newer one, written in his handwriting but dated much later than the original. After he left the region, he continued corresponding with the Guardians. He documented everything: the history of the vigil, the names of Guardians going back 8 generations, the techniques for preserving the copal fire, the location of the archive, the full translation of the tablet. He created this as a record of how to reconstruct the tradition if the mountain was ever disrupted. Marcus took the journal with hands that were shaking. Inside were details of 5 centuries of history, written in his grandfather's careful hand, preserved through decades of uncertainty, and now being offered as a kind of torch to pass forward. "Why are you showing me this?" Marcus asked. "Because you're ready to understand what your grandfather understood," Alicia said. "The real treasure isn't artifacts or documents. It's the continuity of knowledge, the unbroken chain of people choosing to maintain connection to what came before. Your grandfather couldn't be a guardian, but he could be a witness. He could preserve the story so that when the time came, when official frameworks existed, when indigenous rights were recognized, when the world was ready to listen, the truth would be available." Dr. Sandoval was listening carefully, and Marcus could see her mental calculations shifting. The official story was going to be about artifact preservation and indigenous cultural rights, but there was another story here, one about the act of testimony, the power of documentation, the way that witness and record could be as protective as secrecy. "We'll need your cooperation," Sandoval said to Alicia and the cultural officials, "to properly extract the archive and preserve these documents in a way that serves the community while making the knowledge available to scholars." "We'll need guarantees," one of the cultural officials replied, "that the vigil isn't disrupted, that access to the deeper chambers is limited to those with appropriate credentials and cultural understanding, that the fire continues to burn." Indeed, the negotiation that followed was fascinating to Marcus in its complexity. Nobody was arguing against preservation or documentation. The argument was about how, about the balance between secrecy and sharing, between protection and presentation, between the obligations of guardians and the needs of a wider historical record. By the time the sun was setting outside, and the copal smoke continued to rise through the hidden ventilation of the chamber, an agreement had been sketched out. An official interdisciplinary team would be assembled. Extraction of the archive would begin in the dry season. The offering pit would be protected as an active cultural site, with the vigil permitted to continue. And Santiago's journal would be donated to the National Institute of Anthropology, with the understanding that its contents would inform all future work in the cave system. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Chapter 7. The Copal Smoke. Over the following weeks, the cave system became a focal point of unprecedented archaeological attention. Teams of specialists descended into the depths. Conservators trained in handling water-damaged documents, epigraphists experienced in deciphering colonial-era Mayan writing, geological engineers assessing the structural integrity of the shaft and chambers, and indigenous scholars whose role was to ensure that the archive was interpreted not merely as historical data, but as a living testimony to cultural continuity. Marcus spent the first 2 weeks simply documenting the process, photographing the extraction of documents so fragile they required handling in sterile conditions, recording the translations as they emerged. Felipe mapped the entire cave system with laser precision, creating three-dimensional models that revealed the sophisticated architecture of water management and ventilation that had allowed the fire to burn for centuries. But it was during the night shift, when Marcus found himself alone with the offering pit while the rest of the team slept in the camp above, that he understood what his grandfather had meant about the vigil. The fire was burning with quiet constancy, the copal smoke rising in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like a language. And in that silence, with only the distant sound of the underground river and the breathing of the mountain itself, he began to understand the nature of the true treasure. The documents that emerged from the shaft were extraordinary, a record of resistance that had never been written into official history, of communities that had maintained their identity despite everything the conquest could inflict, of knowledge preserved through networks of careful guardians who had chosen continuity over comfort, tradition over profit. One of the earliest documents was a letter written in careful Spanish by a Mayan priest named Ixchop, dated 1562, addressed to the guardians who will come after. In it, Ixchop described the decision to begin the offering ritual as a form of preservation, not to summon spirits or invoke magic, but to maintain an unbroken chain of connection to the ancestors. To ensure that no matter what happened to temples or communities, there would always be one place where the old knowledge remained alive. "The fire is our testimony," Ixchop had written. "It says we remember, it says we continue, it says what was will not be forgotten, and what we choose to preserve cannot be taken from us." The revelation struck Marcus with the force of understanding. The true value of the archive wasn't its potential to generate academic publications or scholarly reputation. Its value was that it testified to human resilience, to the capacity of people to maintain what mattered to them despite forces arrayed against preservation. The copal smoke was literally a message carried forward through time, burned one resin grain at a time by hands determined to keep the connection alive. Alicia had remained with the expedition, serving as cultural liaison and as a kind of living connection between the guardians and the official team. One evening, as they stood together watching the fire, she explained what her family had kept alive. "I'm the 42nd guardian," she said. "My mother was the 41st, her mother the 40th. We can trace the line back continuously. That tablet you saw records the names of the first 8. Before that, there are no written names, only oral tradition. But we know it was maintained through the conquest, through the period when indigenous practice was forbidden, through independence and revolution. Maintained by people who were poor, who had no power, who had nothing but commitment. Why did you step away? The leave of absence from teaching. Because I realized the real teaching wasn't happening in the university, Alicia said. The real knowledge, the knowledge that couldn't be found in any book or archive, was happening here, in the act of maintenance, in the commitment to keep showing up year after year, adding your copal to the fire, adding your name to the list of guardians. That's the education I needed to understand. She paused, watching the smoke rise. Your grandfather understood that too. He tried to transmit it in the journal, but words only take you so far. The real understanding comes from standing here, watching the fire, comprehending that you're part of a chain that extends backward and forward through time. You're not an individual anymore. You're a link. Chapter 8. Race Against Collapse. The collapse came without warning, though in hindsight the signs had been present from the beginning. Felipe's geological analysis had predicted it. The underground river, swollen by heavy rains upstream, was rising faster than the seasonal models suggested it should. The water level in the lower shaft chambers, which normally receded by this point in the dry season, was rising instead. The warning came at 3 a.m., when one of the conservation team members who had been working late descended into the shaft to retrieve a batch of documents and found water where dry stone should have been. Within minutes, the entire team was mobilized. The archive was in danger of being compromised. What followed was controlled chaos, organized with military efficiency. The remaining documents, easily 100 individual pieces, some weighing barely a gram, all fragile as breath, had to be extracted from chambers that were flooding progressively as the underground river exceeded its historical parameters. The core team worked in relay, Marcus and Felipe leading the extraction, while Alicia and the cultural officials managed the rapid documentation and preservation. The water rose faster than anyone anticipated. Felipe made calculations on the fly, assessing the rate of rise against the vertical distance to safety. "We have perhaps 2 hours before the lower chambers are completely submerged," he said, his voice calm despite the urgency. "After that, the deeper archive is lost." "How much remains?" Sandoval demanded. "2/3 of what we identified. The most significant documents are still down there." The decision was made in seconds. Manuel, one of the indigenous officials who had trained extensively in conservation protocols, would lead a final extraction team to the deepest chamber where the most historically significant documents were stored. The others would position themselves as a human chain to rapidly move materials to the surface. Marcus found himself part of the chain, standing in shallow water in one of the middle chambers, receiving documents passed from below and handing them upward. Each piece represented an irreplaceable testimony: letters, census records, spiritual texts, all the articulations of a history that the Spanish conquest had attempted to erase. The water around their ankles was cold and rising visibly. Above them, they could hear the roar of the underground river, which had transformed from distant background sound to immediate threat. Felipe made continuous assessments, checking his measurements, calculating volumes and flow rates with increasing urgency. 7 minutes, he finally announced. Maybe 8, that's the window. Manuel emerged from the deeper chamber with the final batch, documents so fragile they had been stored in sealed ceramic vessels, a preservation technique that had kept them intact for 4 centuries. The water around his waist when he surfaced, moving with desperate care to avoid damaging the materials, even as the cave demanded speed. The ascent was a controlled sprint. Marcus, carrying materials, gasping for breath in the confined space, feeling the weight of 5 centuries of accumulated knowledge pressing against his chest. Behind him, the water pursued with the indifference of physical forces that acknowledge no cultural priority or historical significance. They emerged from the shaft with moments to spare. As the last person cleared the opening, the sound of rushing water intensified below. The river had reached the lower chambers, the archive chamber, the space where documents had rested safely through generations, was being filled with water. "Did we get everything?" Alicia asked, her voice fractured by the adrenaline of the moment. Manuel held up the sealed vessels, the most critical pieces, the genealogies of the Guardians, Ixchop's original letters, the foundational texts, but there are documents below that we couldn't reach. No one spoke the obvious truth, that despite all their efforts, despite the modern equipment and expertise and good intentions, the mountain had claimed a portion of its own history. The flood, which Alicia later explained was likely triggered by an unusual weather pattern, was simply nature asserting its precedence. Some knowledge would remain forever in the darkness below, preserved in water and stone, available to no one. The offering pit, mercifully, remained above the high water mark. The fire still burned. Chapter 9. The Eternal Flame. The final removal and conservation of the archive took another month. The documents that had been extracted were stabilized in the field and then transported under controlled conditions to the National Institute of Anthropology's laboratory in Mexico City, where expert conservators began the long process of preservation, digitization, and translation. But for Marcus, the real conclusion of the expedition happened on the eve of his departure, when the elder guardians invited him to perform a small ceremony around the offering pit. It was unprecedented, allowing someone outside the tradition to participate in the ritual, but the elder had insisted, citing Santiago's journal and the role that testimony had played in protecting the archive. Alicia was there, along with Felipe and Rosa and Miguel. The cultural officials had respectfully declined, understanding that this was a moment for something more intimate than official acknowledgement. The fire burned with its eternal constancy, copal smoke rising, the eons condensed into fragrant breath. "Your grandfather was offered guardianship," the elder repeated, and refused because he said the responsibility belonged to those whose ancestors had received it first. But he also understood that guardianship takes many forms. Some of us maintain the fire with our hands. Some of us record the fire with our words. Some of us witness the fire and carry that witnessing forward into a world that doesn't understand its significance. He extended to Marcus a small pouch of copal. "When you leave here, you carry this, not the physical copal, though it is valuable, but the understanding of what it means to maintain connection, to refuse to let essential knowledge disappear, to choose continuity even when no one else is looking." Marcus accepted it with reverence he didn't entirely understand yet, but knew he would, eventually, in time. The documents, when finally catalogued and made available to scholars, would change academic understanding of the Spanish conquest period. They would reveal networks of indigenous resistance that had previously been invisible to history. They would challenge the master narratives of colonization that had been taught in schools for centuries. But perhaps more importantly, they would demonstrate that knowledge protected through commitment and cultural continuity had as much value as knowledge protected through institutional power and archive walls. Felipe completed his geological analysis and published findings that explained the sacred fire through a combination of ventilation principles and the chemical properties of copal. No magic, no mystery, only elegant physics that had been understood through experience and observation. The paper became required reading in courses on traditional knowledge systems and indigenous science. Alicia accepted a position with the National Institute of Anthropology, while maintaining her role as guardian of the flame. She published a book about the expedition, written for both academic and general audiences, that explored the nature of preservation, the politics of archaeological access, and the way that history itself becomes shaped by who is permitted to interpret it. Marcus donated his grandfather's journal to the Institute with the understanding that it would be consulted in all future work on the archive. He also began writing his own documentation of the expedition, not as an academic paper, but as a testimony, an attempt to capture what it meant to stand in a sacred space, to understand that some things in history matter not because they are rare or monetarily valuable, but because they connect us to essential truths about human resilience and continuity. The copal fire in the Chiapas caves continues to burn. The archive is slowly being digitized and will eventually be available to researchers worldwide. The mountain has been officially protected as a cultural heritage site, and the vigil is now recognized by law as a legitimate form of cultural expression. But the true discovery, the real treasure, was this: that what we preserve matters less than the fact of preservation itself. That commitment, maintained across generations and centuries, becomes its own form of power. That some stories, carefully tended and passed forward with intention, can survive conquest, flooding, and time itself. The smoke continues to rise, the flame continues to burn, and every guardian who adds their copal and their attention to that fire becomes part of a chain that extends backward to Santiago and Ixchop and beyond, and forward to a future when the story will finally be fully understood. Some treasures are not found. They are maintained. They are passed forward by hands determined that what matters will not be lost. That is the eternal flame. Not the physical fire, but the commitment to keep history alive. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.